Welcome everyone to Module 12. In this module, we will talk about moral development theories created by three key theorists, Lawrence Kohlberg, James Rest, and Carol Gilligan. So let's first define moral development. Moral development is the process through which individuals develop more complex principles and ways of reasoning about what is right, just, and caring. Now, throughout this module, we will talk about these three theorists, and let's just give you a quick overview of them before we dig into them deeper. First, we're going to discuss Kohlberg's theory, which is primarily cognitive and developmental based, focusing on the processes of how individuals make decisions and judgments, but not the actual content of those decisions. Next, we will talk about Rest's theories and how he responded to Kohlberg's theory with his neo-Kohlbergian approach, which looks at moral development on the macro level versus Kohlberg's micro perspective. And then finally, we will look at Gilligan's theory, which includes women and focuses on self-care and moral decision-making. So now as we move through each slide with more detail on each of these theorists and their theories, we encourage you to think about how you make moral decisions, how moral development influences you as a student affairs professional, or in whatever field you may be in currently, and how we can support student development. All right, first we are going to talk about Lawrence Kohlberg. He was an American psychologist and served as a professor at the University of Chicago and finally settled in at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. And it's important to talk about Kohlberg first because he was one of the first people to study moral development. He actually followed along in Piaget's studies in adolescence, but he built upon those theories and studies by applying it to college students. And their understanding of rules, moral responsibility, and justice. Kohlberg was actually really interested in learning how moral reasoning changed people as they aged. And he looked at how people make those moral judgments, but not the content of the actual decisions. So Kohlberg started his theories in moral development by conducting a series of tests and studies in Chicago, Illinois. And he did this by presenting a hypothetical scenario to a group of adolescent white boys ages 10 through 16. He presented each boy with the same scenario, which he called the Heinz Dilemma. He created a story around a poor man whose wife was dying, and this poor man goes by Heinz. So he asked a series of questions around whether it was okay for this man to steal medicine for his dying wife. And he asked a series of questions to each of the boys, and here are just a few examples. The first was, should Heinz have stolen the drug? The second, would it change anything if Heinz did not love his wife? The next question, what if the person dying was a stranger? Would it make any difference? And fourth, should the police arrest Heinz for murder if the woman died? The boys' responses were the basis of Kohlberg's six-stage moral development theory, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But with the help of his colleagues, Kohlberg tested and studied his theory with other hypothetical moral dilemmas to validate and organize the series of stages he discovered. So it's important to remember that Kohlberg's theory is a hard stage model, which means that these stages are inflexible and individuals work through the stages in a specific order, and that does not change. But before we can talk about these stages, we need to look at the criteria that frame the stages, the prerequisites for moral development, and conditions for facilitating moral stage development. So let's first talk about Kohlberg's criterion. The first is the structure criterion, which is the most fundamental of the three. At any given stage, individuals use the same level of reasoning no matter what the content or the situation is. The second criterion is the sequence criterion. Here, individuals move through a specific order that does not change even if the environment changes. And finally, the last criterion is the hierarchy criterion. Each successive stage is more highly developed than the one before because it involves aspects of earlier stages. So next, there are two domains of cognition in moral decision making. The first is general cognitive structures, and the second is social perspective taking. These are also known as the prerequisites for moral stage development. Perspective taking is grounded in empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to understand what someone is thinking. Kohlberg hypothesized that perspective taking mediates between cognitive development and perspective taking. Both of these conditions are necessary but not sufficient for moral development. So next, let's talk about the conditions facilitating moral stage development. The first is the higher stage thinking, and this is when one thinks about, thinks one stage above where they currently are to enhance and foster their development. Higher stage thinking can happen when an individual observes someone else's reasoning at a higher stage than they are. For example, this could be a young girl who is noticing her older siblings' reasoning for a moral dilemma. So this is also known as +1 reasoning. The second condition of facilitating moral stage development is disequilibrium, or cognitive conflict. And this can happen in two different ways. The first is when an individual is having an internal conflict with their moral reasoning structures. And the second is when their opinion or decision conflicts with a significant other. Now take a few moments and apply this to your own life. Can you think back to times as an adolescent where you were using higher stage thinking? Who were those people in your life that you looked to and how they made moral decisions? And also take some time to think about when you maybe felt disequilibrium in a decision-making process. So now let's talk about the 6 stages of Kohlberg's moral reasoning. And as we go through each one, remember that this theory, through these stages, people can only pass through these levels in the order listed. Let's also keep in mind the Hines study as we walk through each stage, as that study is really the framework for these 6 stages. So now stage 1, the heteronomous morality. And this is for people to obey the rules, to avoid consequences or punishments. So for example, in the Hines study, some of the boys stated that Hines should not steal the medicine for his dying wife because he would get in trouble for doing so because it was against the law. The second stage is individualistic, and this is where people obey rules as they see fit for their own interests and also realize that others have needs and those needs may conflict with their own. The third stage is interpersonally normative morality, and this is where people start to think about their actions, of how their actions portray them. Shared feelings and expectations take precedence over individual needs and interests. Stage 4 is social system morality. And this is where the social rules and laws are followed. It is no longer about the right and wrong to avoid punishments on an individual or personal level, but how society has set rules for people to follow. For example, in the Hines study, some of the boys said that Heinz should not steal the medicine for his wife because it was against the law, and he needs to follow the law. Stage 5 is human rights and social welfare morality. This is keeping up with the social systems that are created to maintain a fair and just system for all in society. Moral obligation and social relationships are based on making and being able to depend on agreements. So now we get to stage 6, which I find quite interesting. This is morality of universalizable, reversible, and prospective general ethical principles. This stage was actually proven unsuccessful by Kohlberg, and even though it was an important stage to bring his development theory to a logical conclusion. And he received a lot of criticism for this. There is a lot of criticism for Kohlberg's theory, and a large one was his subject selection. And the fact that his subject selection was only 60 boys from a private school in Chicago. This group doesn't represent a significant portion of the population to allow for generalized conclusions and forms a bias against women. Another criticism is that the hard stage model wasn't valid and that individuals can shift in various directions within their moral development, and that this theory was much too simple. These criticisms actually lead us into our next two theorists that we'll discuss because their theories are built off of Kohlberg's theories or are actually a direct response to Kohlberg's theories. So, unlike Kohlberg's stages, which were organized like a ladder, that individuals had to be in one category at a time, uh, Rest and his colleagues proposed three schemas, um, which is related to structures in moral reasoning development, which means individuals don't have to be in one category at a time, nor is there a set order of how individuals develop morally. The first personal interest schema is actually based off of Kohlberg's second and third stage. This is where decisions are all focused on oneself and there is little focus on others or society. This schema is developed throughout childhood until about 12 years of age. But of course, there are exceptions to that. The next schema is the maintaining norm schema, which is borrowed from Kohlberg's fourth stage. In this schema, individuals attain a belief in a set of generally accepted norms that apply to most societies. The third is the post-conventional schema, and this is borrowed from Kohlberg's stage 5 and 6. And this schema places moral obligation on communal values, such as shared ideas, reciprocity, and critical inspection. So now I'll give you a little bit of time to review the factors related to development of moral judgment. Along with the factors related to development of moral judgment, we encourage you to actually go back to Module 1 of this course and watch Matthew's student video from his senior year. And think about Matthew's moral development throughout his undergraduate experience, and think about rest factors and schemas you notice in Matthew's development. This was an example our group thought of quickly as we remembered Matthew dealt with some moral dilemmas early in his time at CSU.
Moving on to discuss Carol Gilligan's approach to moral development. Carol Gilligan is an American feminist and psychologist, professor at New York University, and a visiting professor at the University of Cambridge. Gilligan is best known for her research from her published book In a Different Voice, which presented research from 3 studies, exploring identity and moral development of college students, emphasizing how women make decisions about abortion, and rights and responsibility studies examining different ways of moral thinking and their relationship to different ways of thinking about themselves. Before Carol Gilligan's theory, most theorists didn't include women in their studies on moral development. Kohlberg said women couldn't reach past stage 3 in his theory and saw women as underdeveloped. Gilligan responded to Kohlberg's theory in 1977 by arguing that Kohlberg's model was unable to judge the development of women because their very traits that have traditionally defined the goodness of women, their care for and sensitivity to the needs of others, are those that mark them out as deficient in moral development. Though Gilligan focuses on women in her theory, she argues that this theory is not bound by gender. Carol Gilligan has spent a significant portion of her career examining the relational aspect of moral reasoning. Gilligan shifted from examination of primarily white, privileged women's moral development to a more inclusive examination of women and girls' relationships and how cultural differences influence these relationships and their development. In Gilligan's In a Different Voice, research is presented on 3 studies: identity and moral development in college students, how women make decisions about abortion, and finally, rights and responsibilities study that examine different ways of moral thinking and different ways of thinking about self. Based on Gilligan's study, presenting information that women identify care and responsibility as their moral compass, Gilligan proposed that women's moral development proceeds through a sequence of 3 levels and 2 transition periods. Each level identifies a more intricate relationship between self and others, and each transition represents the achievement of a more sophisticated understanding between selfishness and responsibility. So then, looking at Gilligan's stages of ethics of care, each level identifies a more intricate relationship between self and others. Gilligan's proposed transitions, as they represent this sophisticated understanding between selfishness and responsibility, we have level 1, orientation to individual survival, where we see individualist centered on the self and preoccupied with survival, and also not able to distinguish necessity and desire. Into that, we have the first transition from selfishness to responsibility. We see most salient issue is attachment and connection to others. Consider the opportunity for doing the right thing, and responsibility and care are integrated into patterns of moral decision making. Going into level 2, goodness is self-sacrifice. Here we see survival is predicated on social acceptance. Individuals could give up their own judgment in order to be in consensus and remain in connection with others. And also we see disequilibrium comes up over the issue of hurting others. Level 3, the morality of nonviolence. Individuals raise nonviolence, a moral mandate to avoid hurt, to the overriding principle that governs moral judgment and action, and also respect for self is included. The dichotomy between selfishness and responsibility disappear. Reconciliation allows individuals to recognize their power to select among competing choices and to keep their needs within the mix of moral alternatives. So then when discussing care and responsibility as a moral compass, the study of 29 women facing a moral dilemma, as done by Gilligan, here are the levels based on the dilemma. Level 1, orientation to individual survival. The decision for abortion centers on the self. There is no right decision to be made when it came to one woman's abortion decision because she did not want to be pregnant. The first transition from selfishness to responsibility, this is where selfishness and responsibility first appear. The pregnancy offers immediate and literal connection and attachment to another. However, an adolescent pregnancy generally increases social isolation and precludes the steps towards independence. On to level 2, goodness and self-sacrifice. The women must decide for themselves what is the right choice. They must consider themselves responsible for the actions of others while holding others responsible for the choices they make. So then going into the second transition from goodness to truth, there's a conflict arising when a woman considers her moral obligation to protect life and her inability to do so under the circumstances of the pregnancy. In the second transition, women begin to view their own needs as truth and not selfishness. They begin to include their own needs within the compass of their care and concerns. On to level 3, the morality of nonviolence. In this example about a woman and considering aborting the pregnancy, it becomes clear that there are other options to consider. She can choose adoption as the nonviolent solution, therefore still considering her own needs, but also that of the unborn baby. This framework sees her more as a responsible person as opposed to copping out of the responsibility. The conflict with others will still remain, however, the dilemma itself will now preclude a nonviolent resolution. The choice of abortion is now seen as a serious choice that will affect oneself as others. So you may be thinking, how does this theory apply to the practice in student affairs? Gilligan's theory in student affairs applies for many professionals. An ethic of care is embedded within their personal values and translated daily into our professional practice. Since the profession is premised on a long history of support for and care of students, a long-standing relationship exists between student affairs practice and moral reasoning. Also, Gilligan's ideas of ethics of care and justice have been applied to college counseling, residence life, career planning, service, and leadership development, to name a few. This can also be applied to the context of community development, policy enforcement, conflict management, and team building. So to conclude the presentation on moral development from theorists Kohlberg, Rest, and Gilligan, we have 3 discussion questions for you to think about and answer in the Module 12 discussion prompt. What are the benefits or challenges to utilizing Kohlberg's theory in your work and student affairs? When thinking about college students' moral development, describe a metaphor for the concept and explain its meaning to you. Lastly, Gilligan's theories are geared towards the moral development of women. Do they solely apply to women? In what ways can they apply to those who are not cisgendered women?